All right, well, let's talk a bit more about the history of ethics and professionalism in ABA. So, applied behavior analysis, of course, came from the study of behaviorism, which has its roots in animal research. So, if you aren't familiar with the names of some of the big folks already, that's going to be B.F. Skinner, that's going to be Thorndike, that's going to be Watson. A lot of people contributed to the overall theories. But the most famous, I think, the one that gets the most credit is probably that of B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner is really considered the father of the experimental analysis of behavior, formally explained in 1957. And if you're not familiar with his work, he's famous for the animal models, so the little rats in the maze that had to go and press levers to receive food. And he described the relationship between a behavior of an animal and the consequence, and showed that if you end a behavior with something good, that behavior is likely to occur again in the future. And if you don't, if a person or animal doesn't receive something positive, or if they get something aversive after performing a behavior, that behavior is less likely to occur in the future. The one that is credited with applying this with the autistic individuals is Ivar Lovaas. And for those of you who are familiar with a person-centered language, we typically say individuals with autism spectrum disorder. But according to recent research, those in the autism community tend to prefer identity first term for autistic. So you're going to hear me use that throughout the class. I will also use terms such as on the spectrum, and I will try to use clinical labels to describe levels of functioning. But Ivar Lovaas is really the one who is credited with using applied behavior analytic strategies or behavioral strategies with individuals. I thought this quote to the right side of the screen here was important. This is coming from Peter Killeen from the Futures of Experimental Analysis of Behavior. And what he says is that the goals of experimental analysis of behavior, meanwhile, went unexamined, its anti-mentalistic philosophy untested, and the gap between laboratory and life inevitably widened. This gap can only be bridged by renewed conversations on the fundamentals of our field and new technologies to examine behavior that we have largely ignored. And this is a really important piece to understand in the context of our practice of behavioral therapies today, is that the roots of behaviorism developed when we did not fully understand and acknowledge cognition the way that we do now, especially human cognition. And so when he's saying anti-mentalistic, you might hear the term mentalism. It's as sort of sometimes it's said with a little bit of negativity. And mentalism is a universal or an umbrella term to describe what's going on in the head, thoughts, emotions, and maybe even used to describe reactions or thoughts about physiological experiences. But it tends to be disregarded, or at least the perception is in behaviorism it's disregarded. That's not entirely true, but there is a push in the field to get more of that understanding. And so we'll be talking a bit more about that. But I wanted to put this in here because the experimental analysis of behavior is something qualitatively different from applied behavior analysis. It really does look at the laboratory models of behaviorism, whereas applied behavior analysis is more of the human-based, the human interaction with behavioral therapies. And so because of that human piece, we don't want to lose the sense of humanity in the experimental analysis of it. And that's a really, really, really big, important facet of what we're going to be talking about in this class. So what was the perception of individuals with disabilities at the time that experimental analysis of behavior started to come into fruition? So remember that the disability rights movement began to gain traction in the 1960s, but it didn't really come into realization until the 1970s. And that's where we had a lot of that landmark legal push. So we had IDEA come out, we had ADA start to come out, we had Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act come out. Those are major, major, major laws that have shaped and shifted the perception of individuals with disabilities and the rights that they have. Before that, perceptions of those with disabilities as individuals with rights and agency were not shared by all people. And even still, law does not change perception. Law changes what actions are legal and illegal, but it does not change the beliefs people have about a certain individual. So even therapeutic practitioners may not have had the perspectives that we share today about individuals with disabilities. And here is an example. So this is a quote from the founder of ABA, the quote-unquote founder of ABA, Ivar Lomas, who I talked about in the previous slide. And I thought this was a really interesting quote. And he says, "You see, you start pretty much from scratch when you work with an autistic child. You have a person in the physical sense. They have hair, a nose, and a mouth, but they are not people in the psychological sense. One way to look at the job of helping autistic kids is to see it as a matter of constructing a person. You have the raw materials, but you have to build the person." And I linked the interview there so you could see the whole interview and see where it came from. But if this doesn't sit right with you, that's the point. This is not the way we see individuals today. It should not be the way we see individuals today, especially individuals with disabilities who at one time in history, this was the perception shared by practitioners, by major names in the field. And so I don't bring this out to put an entire cloth of disdain over the field of ABA, but we have to understand our roots if we want to disentangle for some of the atrocities of the past. So the book talks about this Sunland, Miami scandal. And what was found in this scandal was found by a blue ribbon panel and a resident abuse investigation committee that was formed to examine the Achievement Division, which was a experimental research division at the Miami Sunland Training Center. And what they found was that the practitioners or the supervisors who were in this program had a very they were overusing punishment strategies. So specifically what the book states is that the committee found that what started out as an attempt to create a behavior shaping program degenerated, with the best of intentions of those involved, into a bizarre, abusive, and ineffective system of punishment. And if you read the text, I won't go into it here, but if you read the text, it details the systems of punishment, and this is a portion of the newspaper article that was printed about the Sunland Miami scandal. But because of this instance, there was a push to recognize that individuals with disabilities, particularly those who were in quote-unquote behavioral training centers, were not being treated with respect. They weren't being treated as humans, and there were several unethical practices that were going on. Now, the book talks about well-intentioned flaws. I have my own bristle with that. I don't think it should be within us to say, well, these are well-intentioned or not. We just don't know. And so, again, it's, if you're getting some reaction to the language, bring those out. Those are the things that I want to talk about, even if they aren't our textbook, even if they aren't our readings. These are the things that I want us to bring out. What makes you bristle? So these were some of the flaws that were identified. Experimental therapies were done without informed consent. So these were individuals that were in the institution that were going through some sort of experimental protocol, and they didn't know. There was no thought to the impact of food as reinforcers. Now, you might even be in practices or in places where food is provided as a reinforcer. Be thoughtful to that. Food as a reinforcer can have really significant impacts, not only in a state of deprivation, but also as, gummies or rewards, anything like that, where a person isn't necessarily hungry, but it's just something tasty and good. That can alter the way that person interacts with food in general. So there's really no thought to the impact of food as reinforcers. There were overzealous promises on the count of the staff and the doctors that these were going to cure individuals. There's undertrained staff and limited oversight on the use of aversives. So a lot of the punishment techniques were creative, which is not what you want in a punishment technique. You don't want something that is unusual whenever whenever anybody is using any sort of punishment technique. They were unnatural and they were extensive. They were also very frequent. So in the evaluation of the Achievement Division, what they found is that these cases were unusual and that the abuse was systematically applied as part of the program. So in the name of behaviorism, these abuses were systematically done to individuals. They were condoned and in some cases encouraged by supervisory staff, and they were regularly recorded in logbooks. So there was no trying to hide what they were doing. They thought they were doing something experimental and novel and good, and actually they were just documenting systematic abuse. So chapter 1 ends by noting that the key role of oversight involving community citizens who would bring their values, common sense, and good judgment to evaluate behavioral treatment strategies on an ongoing basis. So why do you think this was important at that time? Why have community stakeholders involved in these decisions? And also, does this continue to be important today? And I want you to think about community stakeholders not only in who holds power within a community, but who represents members of a community. A lot of times, the people who are making decisions for other individuals do not necessarily represent the demographic of the individuals who are having decisions made for them. So that is something to think about. So according to the textbook, there were several outcomes of the scandal. First of all, there were consequences to specific employees. Not only the employees who administered abuse, but also the supervisors who condoned and documented it. The Blue Ribbon Committee made various recommendations to prevent similar abuses in the future. So they recommended the oversight, unannounced visits that would allow members of an advocacy group to collect information from key personnel. So this included residents, parents, staff, as well as concerned citizens. There was also a peer review of all behavioral programs to ensure that treatment was derived from the literature and no procedures would be used that were considered experimental. There was also a forbidding of certain aversive practices. This included prohibition of certain bizarre examples of punishment and abandoning seclusion in favor of more positive and appropriate timeout techniques. And then the Sunland Miami scandal ultimately prompted the following big picture outcomes. So in terms of the major impact of the field of behavior analysis, the Arc of Florida took up the cause of human treatment and ultimately endorsed the notion of supporting data-based behavioral treatment using strict guidelines under close supervision by properly trained